The original question examined in the beginning of this book is, what is the relation between the for itself and the in itself? Now this question has evolved with the presence of the other. We now have three modes of being: for itself, for others, for itself in the presence of the other. The other is a transcendent being. When we see the other, we see a body in situation, hence transcendence transcended. When the other sees us, we experience our alienation as a body in situation. We become aware of our body. The experience of shame is an example of this. I am suddenly seen in situation. I am alienated. I am suddenly in the midst of the world as an object among objects. And this existence, which is me, is locked outside of my experience, hence alienation. So the for itself, for others is simply the for itself in the presence of the other. Sartre reviews what we've already covered when he reminds us that the for itself is a annihilation of the in itself. Insofar as the for itself is a annihilation of the in itself, it temporalizes itself as a flight forward, surpassing its facticity towards the in itself it would be if it were able to be its own foundation. This flight takes place towards an impossible future, always pursued, where the for itself would be an in itself for itself, a for itself which would be its own foundation. Sartre emphasizes that the for itself is this flight, is this pursuit. It's not a quality of the for itself, it is the for itself. In the same stroke that the for itself annihilates the in itself, it pursues the in itself. This condition is revealed in our attitudes towards the other, which is what this chapter is about. So, what does Sartre mean by being one's own foundation? In some ways, he means the opposite of facticity. If you take a glance at the predicament of a human being, we emerge from the world without choice. To parents we do not choose, a society we do not choose, a body we do not choose. This is part of the absurdity of our existence. But we are not our own foundation precisely because we do not choose any of the background facts of our existence. And more importantly, we didn't even choose to exist. So, to be one's own foundation is to have a quality that is usually ascribed to God. If you think of the infinite regress of trying to conceive how the universe could be brought into being, this leads us to postulate a being that is its own foundation, that could start itself, that could choose itself. So the for itself is annihilation of the in itself. It is the introduction of freedom, the introduction of consciousness. It's ripped away from facticity, ripped away from the in itself. This ripping away, this annihilation, this upsurge of consciousness, this internal negation estranges us, separates us, leaves us stranded in the nothingness of our consciousness, in the nothingness of our freedom, in the nothingness of our choices, our possibles. All of these things are yet to exist, hence they are nothing. So we are left stranded, lacking. We are stranded in a void, and we seek to fill that void. This is our pursuit. We are at once annihilation of the in itself and a pursuit towards it. In our pursuit, we attempt to cross the chasm that we have created between ourselves as self-conscious beings, the chasm that emerges from the internal negation between ourselves and the objects we identify and carve out from the world. We attempt to cross this chasm as we make ourselves the waiter. If we remember Sartre's description of the waiter at the cafe early on in the book, he's trying too hard to be a waiter and forgetting that he is a transcendent being. Sartre's example of the waiter in the cafe is contrived in all his movements because he is attempting to be a thing, an object. So whenever we identify as a particular role, we in a sense identify with an object. We attempt to fulfill the lack that we are. The alienation that we feel from this rupture, this internal negation, this annihilation, pulls us towards an in itself we cannot successfully become because we are transcendent beings. The future that we attain is always hollow when we attain it. It is always an empty object. Now we're including the other into this equation. The upsurge of the other affects me, captures me as an in itself I cannot apprehend. The in itself captures me in my flight, Sartre writes. I am captured in this flight of which I cannot see, of which is locked outside of me. Yet at the same time, I am accountable for this flight. I experience myself for the other. The other can contemplate my flight. The other sees me in situation. And in this way, it becomes fixed. I become fixed in this flight. My freedom, seen by the other, is simply a characteristic of an object that I am. My flight, my freedom, my pursuit becomes a given to the other. I experience this objectification of my flight as an alienation which I cannot transcend or know, yet I experience it. I experience my being for itself for others. This is where our concrete relations with the other emerge. By concrete, we mean not abstract. We mean understood as specific to a situation. The other looks at me and knows the secret to my existence. The meaning of my being is outside of me. The other has an advantage over me. Now, I could attempt to deny this. The other sees my being in a way that I cannot, and this leads me to either turn my gaze onto him and make an object out of him, thereby denying him in his capacity to determine me in a way that I cannot participate in. As I turn my gaze on him and make an object out of him, I then determine his being as opposed to him determining mine. If I make an object out of him, I deny him his ability to make an object out of me because I deny his transcendence as I perceive him as an object. So just to bring some of this master-slave dialectic stuff into a real-life example, if we think about our attitude towards our boss, for those of us who have regular jobs, my boss sees me, uses me, exploits me. Or maybe I use this job, I use my boss for my income so that I could have the life that I want. So you see this one concrete example of conflict, the possibility of framing it in different ways. Now, some moments you may feel like you're being used, and others you may feel like you are the one who's using. And you can imagine the kind of complexity and nuance that is potentially involved with all of this. And I mention that because you might be saying to yourself that our social relations are not just about conflict. And you might have a point here, but keep in mind that the emphasis on conflict that Sartre is building these ideas on is not without nuance. So in response to this conflict, we can make an object out of the other to escape the look of the other. We can determine the other so as to not be determined by the other. This is one primitive attitude towards the other, according to Sartre. There is, however, another primitive attitude. I could also seek to appropriate the other's freedom, or assimilate the other's freedom, and to maintain his freedom as I do so. To possess the other while preserving his freedom. I may attempt to identify myself with that freedom, thereby claiming what is out of my grasp. I could attempt to apprehend my being for others by assimilating the other's freedom, by having the other. And it is this second path from which Sartre goes on to describe some of the most intimate dynamics of human nature. So there is this possessiveness, this second primitive attitude, this attempt to assimilate the other. And later in the book, Sartre focuses on having, doing, and being as categories of human existence. Sartre will point out later that the word mine, as in mine, this is mine, to have something, this word is a kind of synthesis of being and not being, which is a fascinating observation about language. And this is why the book is worth struggling through. At the end, you have trained yourself to find meaning in the most trivial things, the most obvious of words and actions that are ordinarily taken superficially, always reveal our core condition, the lack that hides behind our desire, the object that hides behind my freedom, the agent that I am, but which is hidden in its nothingness. So the two paths are to either transcend the other's transcendence, thus making the other into an object, or to incorporate the transcendence of the other within me. Sartre describes these two paths as primitive attitudes. The struggle to assimilate the freedom of the other is what is covered in the first section, love, language, and masochism, which I'll save for another video. And I'll probably split this chapter into 3 videos, so stay tuned.